Okay, so we'll get underway. As I say, welcome to our first IFAW webinar of 2025. This webinar is going to reveal the key findings from our Finance Leaders Fraud Report, which is sponsored by Routable, who are also sponsoring our webinar this afternoon. It's going to uncover critical insights from global finance and AP professionals on the evolving risks and challenges of fraud prevention. Our expert panel, who I'll introduce you shortly, will explore the current state of accounts payable fraud, significant gaps in fraud prevention measures, and how emerging technologies like AI are reshaping the fight against fraud. They will discuss research findings from our survey, including the alarming prevalence of fraud within the AP processes, what some of the top challenges are faced by finance teams, and actionable strategies for building more resilient fraud prevention frameworks. So the key topics we're going to look at, we're going to break them down into three, is the most common types of AP fraud and how they exploit system vulnerabilities, the challenges finance teams face due to outdated systems and lack of training, and finally, best practices for implementing modern fraud prevention technologies. So we're joined today, as I say, by two industry experts. First of all, I'll introduce you to Louise Graham, who's a finance operations consultant. Louise, would you just like to give us a little bit of a brief background on yourself,
Yeah,
please?
of course I will. Thank you, Gary. Welcome everyone to the seminar. My name's Louise Graham, and as Gary said, I'm a finance operations consultant. I've been working in the field for many years. I've worked for some banks, some telco, bit of public sector, all sorts of different organisations, which has given me a really good insight into how accounts payable works in various companies. I'm very fond of accounts payable. I think they very often get the blame for not making payment. It's very, very rarely their fault. It's usually a process that's fallen down. And I'm very interested in the subject of fraud because I think it affects us all. So very pleased to be here today discussing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise, and welcome. And secondly, Omri Moore, who is the co-founder and CEO at Routable. Hi, Omri, and thank you very much, first of all, for sponsoring today's webinar and also the Finance Leaders Fraud Report from last year. If you'd like to give us a little bit of background about yourself.
You got it. And thanks for having me, Gary. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Routable. We do accounts payable automation. We primarily work with mid-market and enterprise companies. And I've had a background of building software for accounts payable for about 7+ years now, and another 7 years just working in payments. I too, Louise, love, I'd say, servicing AP professionals and finance professionals. I think that to me, they're firefighters. They're constantly putting out fires. They rarely get to do their job without interruption. So to me, the more I can spend time dedicating my brain power to helping them automate, have assurance, flag weird things, the more fun my job is.
Thank you. One thing's clear, we've all got a passion for AP. And I think the subject this afternoon or today is really, really topical on fraud. So without further ado, we'll move on to our first question, first area that we're going to cover. And in terms of our survey, 65% know an individual or business who have been a victim of fraud in the last 5 years. Now, I'll put this to Louise first. Is that surprising? And secondly, why do you think this is the case?
So, first of all, I think this is quite a high number, but I think the fact that the survey was anonymous probably helped people be very, very honest about the amount of fraud that they know of. I think companies are quite reluctant to talk about it, understandably. You very rarely see it mentioned in the press in terms of big numbers because, let's face it, it's a bit embarrassing if a fraudster managed to get some money out of your company that they didn't deserve. So I think it's becoming more prevalent. I think it's really big business. I think they're very, very organised, and they're also playing a numbers game. Actually, you throw out enough emails, somebody's going to click on a link or somebody's going to make a payment to you because you make it it's urgent. So I think what it proves is this is getting worse, and we all need to be really on the ball about how we deal with it.
Absolutely. Omri, would you like to add anything in terms of your obviously software approach to things?
Yeah, so as Luis is saying, I think it's easier and easier and easier to send spam. So I want to start with the word spam more than anything. I believe that accountants just get spammed daily, and it's getting easier and easier to guess the accounts payable emails for each company, right? Typically, it's AP at. So first and foremost, just because we have more and more investment in AP, it's also telling fraudsters and folks like that that there's more patterns on how to recognize the people in charge of AP at different companies. The 65% doesn't alarm me. It actually gives me confidence because I think that there's two levels to think about it. There's invoice fraud, so external fraud, right? Fraudsters, as Louis said, and then there's internal fraud, which is even more embarrassing to talk about. To me, invoice fraud is just having a lack of protections, procedures, and processes for recognizing things that have deep anomalies. And then internal fraud, then you really start questioning, did I hire the right employees? And do I have the right checks and balances to make sure that even if I approve an invoice, that, the bank info and the credentials that I'm sending the funds to are correct. So there's just so many opportunities. And we ourselves 2 weeks ago got a very fraudulent invoice, right? It looked real. We were able to catch it, but we're a software company that deals in AP. I don't think that the majority of companies have resources to identify these things.
Exactly. And I think if we look at particularly mentioned internal fraud, Omri, I think internal controls obviously play a very important part in that. And that's obviously some organizations maybe need to up their game a little bit on making sure those internal controls are in place and are robust and reviewed regularly.
Yeah, I think the core issue too is that, as we were talking about earlier, accountants are just busy. AP teams are busy. They're typically overwhelmed with the amount of work that they have to do. They have to close their books every month. And without getting additional support and budgets, it makes it very difficult to go through each invoice with the level of rigor that you need. As Lily said, it's easier to spam than ever before, right? And even if you think about it right now, I'd say fraudsters aren't even being obnoxious. They're being boutique about how they're spamming you, right? And you're getting one very well crafted fake invoice. Imagine if you received 100, then you wouldn't actually be able to do your job, period. So we're in a interesting phase of technology meeting fraud.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see how that develops. I mean, it's moving at a pace both for fraudsters and for AP teams, isn't it? So you're trying to keep one step ahead of each other in some ways, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, you have to, and I think that's kind of the question where as as generative AI and more agents are popping on the market, you have to think about it both ways. One, they can help you. Two, they can help the fraudster, right? Um,
Absolutely.
I feel like we're going to experience a 10x improvement in software every year for the next 5 years or so. And that means that the conversation about how you protect your company needs to happen sooner.
Absolutely.
And and we're just going to need to have a different conversation about budgets, like we do for IT teams, and so forth, right? I think that like MDM, like mobile device management, is now a very common practice for CISOs and ITs. And I think that the office of the CFO should have a closer say and budget and voice when it comes to protecting the assets of the company.
Absolutely. Louise, just a quick pointer. In your screen, your name is actually blocking your face a little bit.
Is it? How can
Yeah,
I sort that out?
I don't know how you can change that. So sorry to point. I don't know if you can. That's
If
a
I do
bit
that,
better.
is that
That's
better?
that's better. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, brilliant.
And also, I forgot to mention at the start, if anybody's got any questions they want to put to Omri or Louise, just pop those in the chat. I'm keeping an eye on that so I can ask those as we go through. Okay. Okay, Doc. So we'll move on to the second question now, second area from our survey. 78% of AP teams believe that they could and should be doing more to lower the risk of fraud. But how can we do this? And what are the barriers to this? Louise, would you like to start with this one?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the very first thing to mention, and I was talking to someone about this earlier, is that a finance director actually I was speaking to earlier, is that actually quite often the people working in accounts payable are fairly junior and don't necessarily want to put the hand up all the time. So I think my first thing would say to say would be brave. If you're in accounts payable, be brave. And this finance director said, I'm never ever going to have a problem with someone saying I'm not making that payment. I'm worried about fraud. I'd rather they did that and we didn't make a fraudulent payment, and then it turned out to be okay, than they didn't mention it at all. So I think AP teams need to be brave and speak up, absolutely. And but the leadership teams need to empower them to do that. That is a leadership issue. The leadership cadre needs to say, yeah, you need to do that. I think the other thing is that only I think 31% said that they had fraud training. And I think that's a really important thing. I think um, as Omri mentioned, there needs to be budget set aside for training about fraud. People need to be spotted to train it and know what to do about it. I've seen a phishing email this week that looked very credible. It was spotted, nothing happened, but actually it only took one person to click on that. And there could have been malware or incorrect payment or whatever. So I think that's number two. And I think two other small things. So in terms of internal fraud, only 1% in this survey said that they relied on segregation of duties to prevent fraud. Well, actually, segregation of duties is really important to prevent fraud, especially internal fraud. In fact, mainly internal fraud. You need to not have the same person who can raise a purchase and a purchase order, say, and approve an invoice and do everything along the process to get something paid. And then lastly, but absolutely not least, I was quite surprised to see that survey said only 57% of people made the phone call to check a change of bank account. And that is a really human thing. But this is where humans can make a difference, and this is where accounts payable teams can make a difference. So I've recently in my career, within the last 10 years, we had an instance of a fraudster being into a supplier's email account and sending a very, very credible looking letter saying, we've changed our bank details. It was signed by the finance director of the organization. The company details were correct. The company registered number was correct. It was extremely credible. Somebody inexperienced or who didn't know about the bank account call control might have just made the change. That payment to that supplier that week in this organization was £2 million. So if we'd have made that payment, we'd have paid a fraudster £2 million and we'd have still owed off our supplier £2 million. And it was a supplier that we regularly paid £2 million to every week. And luckily we didn't. And the reason we didn't is that the accounts payable manager rang her known contact at our supplier and said, using a number we held, not the number on the letter, and said, hi, we've had a letter from you asking to change your bank account details. Can I just check this is correct? And they said, absolutely not. We have not changed our bank account details. So it was a fantastic catch. What was interesting, we got a fraud department involved in our main organisation. What was interesting was those fraudsters kept trying. They didn't give up. They kept trying to get us to change the bank details. So they didn't go away even when we'd identified it. We didn't do it. Of course we didn't. But that 57% needs to be higher. That phone call could save you millions of pounds. So I think in terms of what can AP teams do? Get training, speak up, be brave, enforce segregation of duties, and make that phone call if you've got to change your bank account details. It's the easiest thing in the world for a fraudster to do, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Three key areas there that you've highlighted, Louise, definitely. Omri, over to you. What's happening in your world to help organizations lower the risk of fraud?
Well, before I get into lowering the risk of fraud, Luis, I think account takeover is super interesting or business takeover, right? Where they're gaining access to emails, they're getting access to old documents, they can modify things the right way. So two things that we're doing at Routable. One very relevant to the UK example. Louise, we now have instant bank account ownership authorization, meaning if you add a new bank account on our database and you give, the account number, the routing number, the BIC, the SWIFT, etc., the credentials, we can tell you within an instant if the legal name on that bank account matches the legal name on your tax form for the government. I think that's an extremely important thing. So, Louise, maybe it's one extra step that you can actually take prior to making that phone call. But I also recommend that phone call. Um, it's it's pretty cool. We just launched it, and it has a really high certainty, and it actually became a requirement for working with UK banks for our side. Um, the thing that I find interesting, so because we had such a high number report that they've experienced fraud, I don't think that this number is too high. I actually think it can be higher. I think that some AP folks may feel a little bit of exhaustion and disdain around the topic. In theory, I hope that 100% of teams believe they could and should be doing more to reduce risk and fraud. And Luis, you said something really important. You said that a lot of AP professionals are, on the junior side, at least in the inbox and receiving the invoice. I think that right now there is not enough of processes and controls around the segregation of what does an AP clerk do, what does a controller do, and then what does leadership do right after the fact. And I think it's extremely important to identify that in theory, an AP clerk's job is to expedite the receiving of invoices and the bill coding. They're not there to do any forensic accounting, at least today, and they're not trained on that typically. The controller is really there checking that we're making the right journal entries and we're booking to the right GL accounts and the departments and so forth. And then leadership typically checks for amounts or confidence. What I'm trying to get at is that even today, if you think about three specialized individuals in a process that typically should be involved in the AP process, I didn't talk about fraud or risk or anything once, right? So to me, you really have to break this down into when we're talking about external fraud, about invoice fraud and then vendor fraud, right? Because the invoice could be perfectly, modified. And when you're talking about invoice modification, it could be, using the old whiteout method of just pasting over via Adobe the invoice number and using an old one. We ourselves helped one of our customers confirm that invoice for over $1 million was fraudulent, and we were able to show them every point on the document that was fake and that was modified, and how many times it was modified over time. So I do think that investing in the technology is important. The one more thing that I want to say, last winter, or we were at a conference, and Gary and Luis, we printed out three invoices, three of the same invoices, one real, one maliciously fake, and then one that had human error. And there was probably about 15 to 16 mistakes across the three documents. And not a single one of the accountants that we met at this conference had 10,000 attendees. We try to do a prize, find them all, win the prize. Not a single accountant can find all the mistakes. And that's why this is so important, because an invoice alone could have over 10 mistakes. If you're receiving 1,000 invoices a month, how are you supposed to do that? And and if we're not receiving the training and if nobody's paying for the training or the software, it just puts you in a position of hurt because your finance leadership is asking you to process more, faster, cheaper, and they're not giving you the appropriate measurements, tools, and controls to do it. I'll pause there.
Okay, we've actually got a question on it that's come through. I'm not sure if the actual chat is working, but Q&A certainly is. And Crystal Bennett's put through a question. How do you get global coverage to validate bank accounts? Is that
So
possible?
um, working on it, it's a country by country thing. So
Hmm.
for example, right now we can validate bank accounts with certainty in the United States. We can validate bank accounts with the UK. We're starting to explore other countries, but it's a direct relationship between the banking and the federal infrastructure, if that makes sense,
Hmm.
with fintechs. Like it has to be a purpose-driven um, initiative by the country or by the local banks and governments to identify this information so we can get that out. For example, just last week, we had a company come talk to us about validating bank account ownership in Kenya. And we said, hi, we can give you validation if the SWIFT is good, if the local routing number is good, but we don't have that information yet. And it's mainly a data source, right, Gary?
Yeah.
So, Crystal, um, with Canada, it's getting easier. Andrew, if you have specific questions, feel free to email me after
You
the
picked up on that
webinar.
one.
Yeah, but what I want to say is that I believe that countries are quote unquote coming online with this data and wanting to make this data a part of the benefit of working with them, especially for fintechs and financial infrastructures. And I hope, just like we hope that instant payments will become a global thing in the future, that instant payments, which are risky, right? Because it's instant, with account ownership validation can be a new standard relatively soon here.
Good, good. Okay, I'm just conscious of time, so we're going to move on to the last survey point now. 35% of respondents don't believe that they're using any kind of technology to reduce the fraud risk. So we've touched on some of it already. How can technology reduce the risk of fraud? And secondly, why are companies slow to implement these types of solutions? And Omri, would you like to take that one on to start with?
Yeah. I believe that 35% of respondents don't believe that they're using any kind of technology to reduce fraud risk because there's not available. We ourselves just got, like, we've been working as a business for 7 years, and we just got into bank account authorization and validation as a service, and we just launched a forensic accountant AI agent that can check for fraudulent invoices, for doctored invoices, for things that are weird. When I mean weird is like, hi, this invoice has a logo that is 3 pixels to the left and is a different shade of black than what you're used to. I think that the hard thing here is that um, it, I believe that the last 3 to 4 years of innovation in AP has been really focused on automation, Gary, and not.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So, for example, what we as a company have done have focused on what I would call vendor fraud, which is first of all validating TINs, validating government IDs, what I would call know your payee rather than KYC, KYB, if that makes sense. You want to know the recipient, the beneficiary of the funds. So we've worked both on that for bank account validation and authorization, as well as tax form and tax data validation. So we can send the data to your local government and say, as soon as you receive the tax form, is this the right legal name? And are they on any watch list and so forth? So
Mm-hmm.
that's step one. Our second investment here has been building an agent to be a forensic accountant because I'd say over 95% of accounting teams don't have the budget to hire a full-time forensic accountant. And it's typically an after the fact thing. So you lost the money, then you bring in the forensic accountant to see what happened. You put up the controls too late, and typically those controls aren't good enough. So part of it is, I'd say as an AP platform and as a fintech, it is our responsibility to push the envelope of what's available. And then the other part of it, I do truly think is also budget. Because Luis, you said training. I think it should be training plus software, and that training should happen quarterly, most likely. We have training for security at our company that happens almost every quarter. We're just not having the right conversation.
I mean, things are changing in fraud so quickly. So I think new frauds are hitting us. So I think a quarterly review is definitely a great idea in my view. Louise, anything you want to add on what Ormy said? And I've got one quick question that's come through as well. So
Yeah. What I'd add is that there's a bit of it won't happen to us mentality, I think, in businesses.
mhm.
They think, no, fraud, we're really hot on it. It won't happen to us. And once the horse has bolted, there's no point in locking the stable door. So the focus should be on prevention, not on what happens afterwards. And then just before this call started, we had an interesting conversation about can you get insurance for accounts payable fraud? And the answer is you can't easily, because there'd be a huge debate about whose fault is it. Is it your fault, the supplier's fault? Whose fault is it? Although credit insurance is really, really, popular and very common, so it's very common that if one of your customers goes bust and you lose a load of money, you can claim on your insurance. It's not common the other way around to have insurance for accounts payable fraud and for payments that you've made. And the banks will often argue you should have taken steps to know that you were sending it to the right bank account. You should have taken steps to make sure that you didn't accept an invoice from a supplier twice or whatever it is. So I think people think it won't happen to them, and so it's a bit of a leadership thing about taking it seriously, as well as an accounts payable bravery thing about keeping talking about it and keeping putting your hand up whenever you see something that doesn't look right. And somebody asking you to make an urgent payment, especially on a Friday, all those kind of red flags. To click on a link, we're going to put you on stop. All those kind of things ought to just make you pause. And it's better to pause and prevent a fraud than to do anything else. So yeah, I think people don't take it seriously enough, and that they probably need to.
Yeah. Quick question. I think this is from Andrew. A gap we see is we can send payments to an account where the name on the bank account does not match the name in a payment file we transmit, and the banks do not have control to potentially reject those payments given the name mismatch. Is there anything you can pick up on that, or really you'd like to give Andrew an answer
Yeah,
on?
I mean, we see that all the time. For what it's worth, I think the interesting thing is that different banks have a different varying of technologies and resources internally. So I'd say that part of that is um, finding a bank that is trying to be as advanced as possible. But I don't think that banks alone are the solution. I think you have to layer an AP solution on top of your banks. Um, Banks are built to move money and store money and give you amazing interest rates and credit products. I wouldn't say that they're the software company building the controls around it. Um, I'd highly recommend layering more controls. And I think that the interesting thing to me too is that we see a lot of controls being placed at the ERP, but yet again, the ERP doesn't move the money. And that's why I think AP solutions are really critical because AP solutions stitch the data between banks and ERPs. To me, it's not enough to just have an approval on an invoice in your ERP because the ERP isn't going to check that invoice and that ERP doesn't move the money. You just export a flat file and you upload it to your bank. So you're doing a process for what I would call audit controls, right? An auditor comes in and you're showing an auditor that you approved it and the right person looked at it and so forth. However, by not investing in the AP solution, you're kind of missing the fraud side of the controls. So um, I do believe that, you have to work with a bank. I'm not going to dispute that. But at the end of the day, there's a big difference in what I would call audit readiness and fraud readiness, as Luis is alluding to. And audit readiness is what we are training every single accounting team to get ready to, because we have to close our books and we have to do our audits every year. We do it every month and so forth. But I would like to see AP teams go a little bit further and say, okay, we want, we want an AP solution that can help me with compliance, that can help me with audit, and that can help me with fraud. And I think that those should be the three prerequisites outside of just automation. Because Gary, like today, we talked to a customer and we were able to read their invoice within 10 seconds. Speed is here, right? And we were able to capture 100% of the data within 10 seconds. Awesome. We've solved for speed. We've solved for accuracy. I think the next step here is solving for safety and protection and kind of ease of mind. And we're getting there, but the industry is not there. And transparently too, I saw that in 2024 specifically, budgets were an issue across the board for finance. I saw smaller AP teams. I saw lower budgets. And considering that if you receive, for my previous example, 1,000 invoices per month, that's 12,000 invoices per year. I don't know how many pages are on each invoice, right? So let's say that there's 3 pages per invoice. Now we're talking about 36,000 pages you have to go through, and one mistake is the only thing you need to potentially lose your job, put yourself out of business, or just create the uncomfortable conversation at work. So that's why I think this is a really, really, really important topic, and I'm spending a lot of my time figuring out how to prevent it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I absolutely agree that budgets are so important to put some money aside to try and combat or reduce the risk of fraud. I mean, how do you think organizations can actually overcome that major hurdle of getting budgets for this very, very important area?
I think it's a leadership conversation, but they also need our help in conversations like this. Um, we at our company spend a lot of money on what I'd say CISO related security, IT, compliance, and so forth. I think that during the past decade, resourcing and budgeting for IT at companies has become a common conversation. There are just multiple ways to ingest data, protect data, and so forth. We're also seeing in the world of generative AI, there's more and more conversations about securing your data. What I'm trying to say is that we just need to be more vocal, and accountants need to be more vocal, and finance need to be more vocal. And I think that this just needs to be a part of your budget line to make your audit easier. Your audit's going to cost you money no matter what. Maybe the conversation here is how to make sure that your audit is quicker and that your funds processing throughout the year is safer. Especially if you're a mid-market or an enterprise company. We see companies moving $1 billion a month.
Mm-hmm.
It's scary.
Yeah,
And the bigger you are, the likelier it is that you can have a mistake either internally or externally.
absolutely. Louise, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I'd just add something interesting that's happened to me in the sort of past couple of years, which is that a phishing email came in saying, "Can you repay this loan?" Actually, which was very odd terminology. That should have been a red flag to start with. It wasn't a company who took out loans. Can you click this link? Can you pay it by standing order? And it appeared to come from the CEO. And nobody clicked, nothing happened. It was fine. There was no fraud. But actually, off the back of that, this organisation has said, okay, fine, nothing happened, but bit of a near miss, could have done, and has then said, I think we should have some training. Because actually, even that near miss sort of scared them enough to think, yeah, hold on. We could have clicked on that. We were so close and we didn't. And actually, it's far better to have that sort of conversation about training and making sure people know what to look out for before you've actually lost any money, rather than after the horse has bolted, as I said before. So I think it needs to be about prevention rather than cure, and finance leadership teams need to start taking that really seriously. Yeah, absolutely. You don't want, as a CFO or finance director, to be going to your chief exec and saying, "I'm really sorry, we just lost £1 million because somebody who was paid, a lot less than you as the CEO, clicked on a link and just made a payment because they were panicked into it." Not good enough. You need to invest in your people and let them be brave and get them trained. That's what I'd say.
Absolutely. We're getting close to finish time. But I think you mentioned, Omri, that you see technology developing really, really fast over the next few years. Anything that you want to tell us that you think is going to be coming downstream in that particular period of time that's going to help
I'll start
AP
with what's
teams?
going to hurt first. I think that it's going to become easier and easier and easier to use generative AI and agentic AI to create impersonation and documents and anything like that. As I was mentioning, we're launching our first forensic accountant agent for our customers. Um, it's going to take a lot of time and data to catch everything, Gary. My hope is that we will have breakthroughs for finance like we did for IT in the past decade, if that makes sense. To me, it's not just the invoice, it's the IP address where it was sent from. It's the signature on the email. If you think about it, there's so many layers to things going wrong in invoice fraud, and especially also in account takeovers, as you were saying, Luis. So I'm excited about what we're launching now. And I think that it will need to be a direct back and forth conversations with our customers and with finance leaders and with, controllers and AP clerks about how we can improve visibility and what we can do more. We talk to our customers every week. We love talking to our customers. That said, it needs to be a collaborative effort between software companies and fintechs like us and the leadership at the office of the CFO and folks like yourself talking
Mhm.
about what are the parameters, what do trainings look like, and what are the checklists that I should have as a CFO, as a controller, as a director of finance, or even as an AP clerk to feel confident at every step of the way as I am bringing data, invoices into my system, and as I am storing that stuff in my ERP and as I'm releasing the funds.
Good. Louise, anything you want to add? You see happening, exciting, or to help us with fraud prevention?
No, but I think I just want to say again that I think the people who work in accounts payable are amazing. They do a really difficult job. They quite often take abuse on the phone or by email for not making payments. They can almost always not be the reason that the payment's not been made. It's usually a process somewhere else. So I think people who work in accounts payable should continue to do what they do really well and put their hand up for getting the training they need and getting the support they need in preventing fraud and dealing with all these quite frightening new things that are coming up like AI and impersonation, things that are really sophisticated. So yeah, keep going.
Absolutely. Well, it's fair to say, IFO, we are definitely looking to support AP teams with fraud. We've got a couple of, we've worked on a fraud certification program, which is in the pipeline. We've got another one for fraud risk manager that's currently underway. We're looking at things like fraud accreditation programs that can help organizations, workshops, etc., etc. So keep an eye on what's going to be happening with IFOL over the next sort of 12 months. There's a lot of things around fraud. We'll have other webinars and masterclasses as well. So we're just about at 40 minutes, which is about the length that I was told that the webinar would last for. It's been really interesting to hear the views from Omri and Luis. Thank you very much. And I hope the participants have, even with some of the case studies that have been mentioned, you've picked up some best practice and tips to keep a lookout for. That's really making sure that your teams are fully aware of fraud. Training, very, very important, obviously. So I would just like to thank Omri and Louise for participating today. And thank you very much for everybody that's joined us. And we will be announcing future webinars very, very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thanks.
you.